Jake Morrison's boots hit the metal floor of Starshelter Station with a hollow clang that echoed through the massive docking bay. He'd traveled 3 months across the galaxy to get here, leaving behind everything familiar on Earth. The station floated in the darkness of space, orbiting a dying neutron star that painted everything in shades of cold blue light. This place was built for one purpose only, to hold the galaxy's most dangerous creatures, the ones too powerful or too hated to live anywhere else. A tall alien with gray-scaled skin and 4 glowing eyes met him at the entrance. Commander Thax didn't offer a handshake or a welcome. He just looked Jake up and down like he was measuring a coffin. "You're the human they sent," Thax said. It wasn't a question. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "Jake Morrison, xenobiologist," Jake replied, extending his hand anyway. Thax stared at it for a long moment before turning away. Jake dropped his hand and followed. The station was enormous. Corridors stretched in every direction, lined with reinforced cells containing creatures Jake had only read about in textbooks. He saw a creature made entirely of living crystal that hummed with dangerous energy. Another cell held something that looked like a floating mass of tentacles and teeth. Security drones patrolled constantly, their weapons always charged and ready. "Starshelter isn't a zoo," Thax explained as they walked deeper into the facility. "Every being here has been deemed too dangerous for normal containment. Some destroyed entire colonies. Others are the last of their kind, kept alive only for study." Jake took notes on his datapad, trying to absorb everything. The air smelled sterile and cold, recycled 1,000 times over. Nothing about this place felt alive. Felt like a tomb. They descended 5 levels, each one more heavily guarded than the last. The creatures in these lower cells were kept in near total darkness. Warning signs covered the walls in dozens of languages. Jake recognized a few: extreme caution, lethal force authorized, do not approach under any circumstances. That's when Thax stopped in front of a cell at the very end of the corridor. The door was triple reinforced, surrounded by energy barriers that crackled with deadly power. The observation window was the only way to see inside, and it was covered in scratches and dents from the inside. "Don't even think about it," Thax warned, his 4 eyes narrowing. "Specimen 7 Chi is a void dragon. His kind slaughtered billions before we hunted them down to almost nothing. There's a reason he's in the deepest, darkest hole we have." Jake pressed his face to the window, trying to see through the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then his eyes adjusted and he sucked in a sharp breath. A massive creature lay in the center of the cell, chained to the floor with restraints that glowed with containment energy. The dragon's scales were black as space itself, but they were covered in scars, deep gouges and burn marks that spoke of violence and pain. One wing was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken and never properly healed. The creature was barely moving, just the slow rise and fall of labored breathing. "When's the last time someone checked on him?" Jake asked quietly, unable to look away. Thax snorted. "We throw food in once a week through the automated system. That's more than it deserves. Do you know what void dragons did during the expansion wars? They destroyed 17 colony worlds. Billions dead. Men, women, children, they didn't care. They burned everything." Jake had read the reports during his journey. Every species in the galaxy feared void dragons. Their very name meant world enders in the old galactic tongue. They were supposed to be pure destruction, creatures of rage and hate that couldn't be reasoned with. But looking at this broken creature in the darkness, Jake saw something different. "How long has he been here?" Jake asked. 32 years, Thax replied. "Caught him after the last void dragon nest was destroyed. The council wanted him executed, but some scientists argued he should be kept for study. So here he rots." Thax turned to leave, clearly done with the conversation. "Come on. I'll show you the specimens you'll actually be working with." "Wait," Jake said, still staring through the window. As if sensing he was being watched, the dragon's eyes suddenly opened. They glowed golden in the darkness, ancient and intelligent. Jake expected to see hatred there, or maybe the mindless rage the reports described. But that's not what he saw. He saw pain. Deep, soul-crushing pain that reminded him of injured animals back on Earth, creatures that had been hurt so badly they'd given up hope. The dragon stared directly at Jake, and for a moment neither moved. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. This close, even through reinforced glass and energy barriers, he could feel the raw power radiating from the creature. This was a being that could probably tear through the station's hull if it wanted to. But it just lay there looking at him with those golden eyes. "That thing is a killer," Thax called from down the corridor. "Don't let it fool you with sad eyes. Void dragons are manipulators. It's how they hunted." Jake finally pulled himself away from the window and followed Thax, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. The galaxy called them monsters. The reports called them world enders. But Jake had spent his whole career studying behavior, and what he saw in that cell wasn't a monster. It was a prisoner who'd been broken by decades of isolation and hate. Jake Morrison made a decision that first night that would change everything. The next morning he walked straight back to the lowest level of Starshelter Station, carrying his breakfast and a folding chair. Commander Thax watched him from the security booth with all four eyes narrowed in disapproval, but said nothing. Jake set up his chair right outside the energy barrier of Cell 7 Chi and sat down. He unwrapped his sandwich and started eating, talking out loud like he was having a conversation with an old friend. "So, on Earth we have these animals called dogs," Jake said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "Thousands of years ago they were wolves. Wild, dangerous, everyone feared them. But humans decided to try something different. We fed them. We showed them kindness. And you know what happened? They became our best friends." The dragon didn't move. It stayed in the shadows, barely visible. Jake came back the next day. And the day after that. Every single morning he'd sit outside that barrier with his meals, talking about home. He told stories about cats who thought they owned their humans. About horses that could sense human emotions. About how Earth used to have creatures called elephants that remembered kindness for decades. On day 4 the dragon finally reacted. A low growl rumbled through the cell, making the floor vibrate beneath Jake's feet. But Jake didn't run. He just kept talking. "I know you can understand me," Jake said calmly. "I've read your species profile. Void dragons have intelligence levels that match or exceed most galactic species. You know every word I'm saying." The growl grew louder, but Jake noticed something. The dragon had moved slightly closer to the light, just enough that Jake could see more of its face. Those golden eyes were watching him intently. By the end of the first week, other station personnel started noticing Jake's routine. Dr. Rita Hayes, a biologist from the Centauri colonies, cornered him in the cafeteria one evening. "You're wasting your time with that monster," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you know what void dragons did to my people? They burned 3 of our colony worlds to ash. Thousands of my ancestors died screaming." Jake looked up from his meal. "Did this dragon do that? Did Kai personally attack your worlds?" Rita blinked, caught off guard. "What? You said, that thing killed thousands of your people's ancestors," Jake replied quietly. "But did he? Or did his species do it? When's the last time anyone actually talked to him as an individual instead of blaming him for what others did?" Rita opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't have an answer. "That's what I thought," Jake said. "We're punishing him for the crimes of his kind. On Earth we learned that was wrong. We learned it the hard way over centuries of mistakes. But we learned." The second week brought more dramatic changes. The dragon, Jake had started calling him Kai, shortening the specimen number to something that felt more like a name, became increasingly agitated. He would slam his massive body against the energy barrier, roaring in a voice that shook the entire station. Alarms would blare. Security teams would rush to the lower levels, weapons ready. But Jake kept coming back. "I know you're angry," Jake said one morning after a particularly violent outburst. "I would be too. 32 years in a dark cell, treated like an object instead of a person. No one talking to you. No one caring if you're in pain. That's not life. That's just existing." Kai's golden eyes fixed on him, and for a moment, Jake could swear he saw understanding there. On day 23, Jake walked into Station Director Cole Bennett's office with a formal proposal in hand. Bennett was a broad-shouldered man from the Mars colonies, tough as nails and not easily impressed. "Director Bennett, I'm formally requesting permission to begin a behavioral rehabilitation program with Specimen 7 Chi," Jake said, sliding the datapad across the desk. Bennett stared at him for a full 10 seconds before bursting into laughter. "Rehabilitation? Of a void dragon? Morrison, I don't know what kind of fantasy world you're living in, but the Galactic Council will never approve that. Do you understand what you're asking? That creature is one of the most hated beings in known space." "I understand perfectly," Jake replied calmly. "That's why I'm invoking Article 7 of the Human Accord." The laughter died instantly. Bennett's face went pale. "The Compassion Clause? You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious." Jake pulled up the legal documents on his own datapad. Article 7, Section 3 specifically states that any human representative has the right to advocate for reformation over execution for any sentient being, regardless of species or past actions. It's been invoked only twice in our history, but it's legally binding across all treaty territories. Bennett leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his gray hair. The Council is going to fight this. Let them, Jake said. The law is clear. They have to grant me supervised access to attempt rehabilitation. If I fail, they can proceed with whatever they want. But I get my chance. The approval took 3 days. The Galactic Council argued, threatened, and tried every legal loophole they could find. But Earth's representatives stood firm, and the law was on Jake's side. When the authorization finally came through, Jake stood outside Kai's cell with his heart pounding. Every security officer on Starshelter station was watching through cameras, weapons charged and ready. Commander Thax stood nearby, his hand hovering over the emergency containment button. "This is your last chance to back out," Thax said quietly. Jake shook his head. "Drop the barrier." The energy field flickered and died. For the first time in 32 years, nothing stood between the Void Dragon and freedom. Jake stepped inside. Kai rose from the floor, chains rattling as he moved. In the light, he was even more massive than Jake had realized. 12 feet of scarred black scales, broken wings that would never fly again, and claws that could tear through steel. The dragon's golden eyes burned with an intensity that made Jake's survival instincts scream at him to run. But Jake stood his ground. They faced each other in silence, human and dragon, separated by decades of fear and hate. Then Kai spoke. His voice was rough, like he'd forgotten how to use it, but the word was clear. "Why?" That single word changed everything. Jake spent the next 3 months sitting in Kai's cell every day listening. The dragon's real name was Keltharax, though he said that name felt like it belonged to someone who died long ago. He'd been just a hatchling when the war began, barely old enough to fly. "Tell me what really happened," Jake said one afternoon, his recording device sitting between them. "The official records say your species attacked without provocation. They say void dragons were monsters who loved destruction." Kai's golden eyes closed for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of buried pain. "They came to our world first," Kai began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The mining corporations. We called our planet Valtherus. It was beautiful, Jake. 3 moons, purple skies, oceans that glowed at night. Our kind had lived there for thousands of generations." Jake leaned forward, listening intently. "The corporations wanted the crystal formations in our planet's core. They said it was valuable, could power their ships and stations. Our elders met with them, tried to negotiate. We offered to help them mine safely, to share the resources. But they wanted it all, and they wanted it fast." Kai's claws scraped against the metal floor, leaving deep scratches. "They started drilling without permission. Massive drills that went straight to the core. Our planet started shaking. Earthquakes that had never happened before. Our nesting grounds collapsed. Hatchlings died. The elders went to them again, begging them to stop before they destroyed everything." "What did they do?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "They sent warships," Kai said, his voice hardening. "Said we were threatening their legal operations." "Legal?" "They made it legal by paying off council members, by filing paperwork in languages we didn't understand. When we tried to defend our homes, they called it an act of war." Jake felt his stomach turn. He'd suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was different. That night, Jake started digging into the station's classified archives. He knew he was breaking protocols, but he didn't care anymore. He used every trick he'd learned during his years in research, bypassing security systems and cracking encryption codes. It took him 3 weeks of late nights, surviving on coffee and determination. Finally he found them. The sealed historical records, buried under layers of classification and misdirection. Jake's hands shook as he read through the documents. There were communications between the mining corporations and galactic officials, discussing how to handle the dragon problem. There were financial records showing massive bribes paid to council members. There were military reports that clearly stated the void dragons had only attacked after their planet was already dying, after their attempts at peaceful negotiation had been met with violence. The records showed that when the void dragons finally fought back, desperate to save what remained of their world, the galaxy's propaganda machine sprang into action. News outlets across 1,000 worlds reported unprovoked attacks by savage beasts. The corporations painted themselves as victims. The council authorized a war of extinction, and the galaxy cheered as the void dragons were hunted down to the last few survivors. "They made us the villains," Kai said when Jake showed him the evidence. "So no one would question what they'd done. So no one would ask why an entire species had to die for corporate profits." Jake knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep this secret. The galaxy needed to know the truth. He published everything through Earth's independent networks, bypassing the normal galactic channels that could be censored or blocked. Within hours, the story was spreading across human colonies. Within days, it had reached other species who'd grown tired of the Council's official narratives. The response was explosive. Half the galaxy was shocked, demanding investigations and accountability. The other half was furious that anyone dared question the official history. Ambassador Vincent Torres from the Draxian Empire sent a formal demand for Jake's immediate arrest. Commander Thax received direct orders from the Council to terminate the rehabilitation program and return Kai to isolated containment. Station Director Bennett called Jake to his office, looking exhausted and conflicted. "They want you off this station," Bennett said. "And they want that dragon locked down permanently." But before Bennett could do anything, things escalated in a way no one expected. A group of station personnel, species whose worlds had lost people in the war with the Void Dragons, decided to take matters into their own hands. They cornered Jake in a maintenance corridor on level 3, their faces twisted with rage and grief. "You're protecting a monster," one of them shouted, a Centauri officer with burn scars on his arms. "My grandmother died when his kind destroyed our colony." Jake tried to explain, tried to show them the evidence, but they weren't listening. They moved closer, and Jake realized with growing fear that they intended to hurt him, maybe worse. That's when the alarms started blaring. Kai had broken through his reinforced cell. Not through the door, which would have taken too long, but through the reinforced wall itself. Security footage later showed him tearing through metal and concrete with desperate strength, his broken wings dragging behind him. He didn't head for the docking bays to escape. He didn't attack the guards who tried to stop him. He followed Jake, sent straight to that maintenance corridor. Jake heard him coming, the thunderous footsteps that shook the station. The angry mob heard it too and scattered in panic. But Jake stood frozen as Kai rounded the corner, this massive creature that the galaxy called a monster. Kai didn't attack. He positioned himself between Jake and the fleeing station personnel, spreading his broken wings as wide as they could go, shielding Jake with his own body. He could have killed everyone in that corridor. Instead, he protected the one person who'd shown him kindness. Security cameras captured every second of it. The footage was transmitted automatically to the Council as part of emergency protocols. But someone on the station leaked it to the public networks. Within hours, the video had been viewed billions of times across thousands of worlds. The galaxy watched as the creature they'd been taught to fear, the monster they'd hunted to near extinction, chose mercy over revenge. Chose to protect rather than destroy. The galaxy's perspective began to shift, one viewer at a time. The Galactic Council chamber was the largest room Jake had ever seen. It stretched upward for what seemed like miles, with viewing platforms arranged in concentric circles where representatives from 300 different species sat watching. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime, converting thousands of languages into a cacophony of whispers. Jake walked down the center aisle with Kai beside him. The dragon's claws clicked against the polished stone floor, each step echoing through the vast space. Every eye in the chamber was on them. Some looked curious. Most looked afraid. A few looked like they wanted both Jake and Kai dead. They reached the center platform where a single spotlight illuminated a circle barely large enough for both of them. Jake stood straight, trying not to show how terrified he actually was. Kai's presence beside him was both comforting and terrifying. This dragon could end everything in seconds if he wanted to. High Counselor Vex loomed above them on the highest platform. He was a Corinthian, a species that looked like walking mountains of stone and crystal. His voice boomed through the chamber without needing amplification. Jake Morrison of Earth and Specimen 7 Kai, designated Keltharax of the extinct void dragon species, you stand before this council accused of multiple violations, Vex announced. Unauthorized release of classified information. Conspiracy against galactic peace. Endangering the safety of all civilized species. What defense can you offer? Jake's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to speak. Counselor, I offer the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. He pulled out his data pad and projected the evidence for everyone to see. Medical scans filled the air above them, showing Kai's brain chemistry, the neural pathways damaged by decades of isolation and torture. The scans proved that Kai's aggressive behavior wasn't natural, it was a response to trauma. These scans show what 32 years of imprisonment did to him, Jake said, his voice growing stronger. You didn't contain a monster. You created one through neglect and cruelty. Next came the historical records, the documents Jake had uncovered. Communications between mining corporations and council members. financial transfers that could only be called bribes. Military reports that contradicted the official story told for 3 centuries. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The war with the Void Dragons wasn't about defense, Jake continued. It was about covering up corporate crimes. They destroyed an entire planet for profit, and when the dragons fought back to save their home, you labeled them as monsters. These documents are classified for reasons of galactic security, a council member shouted from the upper platforms. You had no right to access them. I had every right, Jake shot back. Because the truth matters more than your security classifications. High Counselor Vex raised one massive hand for silence. The council will hear from the accused dragon. Keltharax, you may speak. The chamber fell silent. For the first time in 3 centuries, a void dragon would address the Galactic Council. Kai stepped forward, his golden eyes sweeping across the assembled species. I do not ask for forgiveness, Kai said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. I know many of you lost loved ones in the war. I lost everything too. My family, my world, my entire species. I ask only one thing, let history remember the truth. My people were not monsters. We were victims who fought back against extinction. Jake watched the faces in the crowd. Some showed sympathy. Others showed nothing but hate. Prosecutor General Tyler Hayes stood from the human delegation section. He was an older man from the Terran Coalition, his face hard and unforgiving. Jake's heart sank. Even his own species was against him. This creature is manipulating Jake Morrison, Hayes declared. It's what predators do. They find the weak, the naive, and they exploit them. The dragon has convinced one foolish human to risk galactic security for its own survival. The chamber erupted in agreement from multiple species. Jake felt the momentum shifting against them. They were going to lose. Kai would be executed, and Jake would probably spend the rest of his life in prison. That's when Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. I invoke the right of kinship, Jake announced loudly, his voice cutting through the noise. The chamber went silent. Every translator in the room seemed to pause as if they couldn't believe what they'd heard. Under Article 12 of Human Law, recognized by the Galactic Treaty of 2247, I formally adopt Keltharax as my legal kin, Jake continued, his heart pounding. His actions are my actions. His fate is my fate. If you execute him, you execute me. If you imprison him, you imprison me. We are bound now by law and by choice. Gasps and shouts erupted from every platform. Even the human delegation looked shocked. Ambassador Patricia Chen from Earth stood up, her face pale. Morrison, do you understand what you're doing? She asked. No human has ever invoked kinship with a non-human species, let alone a void dragon. I understand perfectly, Jake replied. High Counselor Vex leaned forward. This is unprecedented. The council must deliberate. But before deliberations could begin, Commander Thax stood up from the station personnel section. Jake was shocked. Thax had been his biggest opponent throughout this entire process. I wish to speak, Thax said, his 4 eyes fixed on the council. Speak, Commander, Vex allowed. I've watched Jake Morrison and Keltharax for 6 months, Thax said slowly. Every day, every interaction. That dragon had 1,000 chances to kill Morrison. 1,000 opportunities to escape, to cause harm, to prove everyone right about his species. He never did. Not once. Thax paused and Jake could see the struggle on his face. Maybe we were wrong, Thax continued. Maybe we've been wrong for 300 years. Maybe it's time we stopped punishing one being for the actions of many. The chamber exploded into debate. Species argued with each other across platforms. Some demanded immediate execution. Others called for investigation into the historical records Jake had revealed. High Counselor Vex called for order, but it took nearly an hour to restore calm. Finally he announced the vote. The numbers appeared on the massive display screens. The chamber held its breath as votes were tallied from 300 species. The count stopped at a perfect deadlock. Exactly half voted for mercy. Exactly half voted for execution. Then something extraordinary happened. Ambassador Chen stood up, followed by every member of Earth's delegation. The human government wishes to make a statement, Chen announced. If this council votes to execute Keltharax, Earth will immediately withdraw from 12 major galactic treaties, including the Defense Pact and the Trade Agreement. It was a threat that shook the foundations of galactic politics. Earth wasn't the most powerful species, but they were influential enough that their withdrawal would cause economic chaos. High Counselor Vex looked at the human delegation for a long moment. Then he looked down at Jake and Kai standing together in the spotlight. The council has reached its decision. The human colony ship, New Horizon, pulled away from Starshelter Station on a cold morning that Jake would never forget. He stood at the observation window watching the massive containment facility grow smaller in the distance. Kai sat beside him, finally free of chains for the first time in 32 years. "Are you scared?" Jake asked quietly. Kai's golden eyes reflected the stars outside. "Terrified. I've been in that cell for so long I forgot what freedom feels like. What if I don't know how to live anymore?" Jake put his hand on Kai's scarred scales. "Then we'll figure it out together. That's what family does." The council's decision had come with strict conditions. Jake and Kai couldn't stay on any major world or station. They needed somewhere remote, somewhere they could be monitored but also left alone. Earth's government offered a solution: Haven's Rest, a small terraformed world on the edge of human space. It was beautiful but isolated, perfect for what Jake had in mind. When they arrived 3 weeks later, Jake stood on the landing pad and looked out at rolling green hills, purple forests, and a sky painted orange by the local sun. The air smelled clean and alive, nothing like the recycled atmosphere of Starshelter. Kai stepped off the ship carefully, his claws touching natural ground for the first time in decades. He stood there for a long moment, then slowly spread his broken wings as wide as they could go. He couldn't fly anymore, would never fly again, but the gesture was one of pure freedom. "It's beautiful," Kai whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jake spent the next 6 months building the sanctuary. He wasn't alone. Volunteers came from Earth and other human colonies, people who'd followed the story and wanted to help. They constructed habitats designed for creatures who needed second chances. Medical facilities. Observation domes. Living quarters that respected both human and non-human needs. The galaxy watched with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Some called it foolish. Others called it dangerous. But Jake didn't care about the critics. He cared about giving broken beings a place to heal. Then 8 months after they arrived on Haven's Rest, something incredible happened. Jake was working in the main habitat when the proximity alarms went off. 3 unknown signatures were approaching from deep space, moving faster than anything on record. Security protocols demanded he activate the defense shields, but something made him hesitate. Kai ran outside, his scales shimmering in the afternoon light. He looked up at the sky and made a sound Jake had never heard before, a deep melodic call that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. 3 shapes appeared in the clouds. Dragons. Void dragons, their black scales gleaming as they descended toward the sanctuary. "Others survived," Kai said, tears streaming down his scaled face. "I thought I was the last. I thought I was alone." The 3 dragons landed carefully in the open field. They were thin, scarred, clearly having spent centuries hiding in the darkest corners of space. They looked at Kai with eyes that held generations of pain and fear. Then they looked at Jake, this small human standing beside their brother. "Is it true?" one of them asked, her voice rough from disuse. "Is there really a place where we don't have to hide anymore?" Jake stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Welcome to Haven's Rest. You're safe here. You're home." Life on the sanctuary fell into a rhythm after that. The dragons began to heal, both physically and emotionally. Jake brought in specialists from Earth who worked tirelessly to help them recover from centuries of trauma and hiding. 1 year after arriving on Haven's Rest, Jake stood in the observation dome watching something that made his chest tighten with joy. Kai was in the central courtyard with a young girl named Lily, whose parents worked at the sanctuary. The 7-year-old sat cross-legged on the ground, completely fearless as the massive dragon told her stories about Valtherus. "And that's when the 3 moons would align," Kai said, his voice gentle and patient. "The oceans would glow so bright you could read by their light." "I wish I could have seen it," Lily said sadly. "Maybe someday," Kai replied, "when we rebuild, you'll visit a new void dragon world and see it yourself." Lily squealed with delight as Kai gently lifted her with one wing, setting her on his back. Her laughter echoed across the sanctuary, pure and joyful. The galaxy's most feared creature, playing with a human child like they'd been friends forever. Jake felt tears in his eyes. A year ago this would have been impossible. Now it was just another afternoon at the sanctuary. "You changed everything," Jake said as Kai approached the observation dome later, after Lily's parents had taken her home for dinner. Kai's golden eyes caught the light of the setting sun, making them glow like molten gold. "No, Jake Morrison. You did. You looked at a monster and saw a person. That is not something my people knew was possible. You gave us hope when we'd forgotten what hope felt like." The comm system in the dome chimed with an incoming news broadcast. Jake almost ignored it, but Kai nodded toward the screen. The news anchor was reporting on the Galactic Council's latest session. After a year of investigations into the documents Jake had revealed, they'd reached their conclusions. The Void Dragons were officially pardoned. The historical records were being rewritten to reflect the truth. 12 different species had issued formal apologies for their roles in the Extinction War. But Jake wasn't really watching the news. His attention was on the view outside the dome. In the distance, the 3 other Void Dragons were carefully constructing nests from branches and stones, working together with a purpose Jake recognized. He'd seen the same behavior in birds back on Earth. Are those? Jake asked, hardly daring to believe it. Nesting grounds, Kai confirmed, his voice full of wonder. We're preparing for eggs. The first new generation of Void Dragons in 300 years will hatch here, under human protection. Jake couldn't speak. His throat was too tight with emotion. The galaxy spent 300 years learning to hate, he finally managed to say. I guess we just needed to remember how to give second chances. Kai lowered his massive head, pressing his forehead gently against Jake's in the traditional Void Dragon gesture that meant family, that meant trust, that meant forever. And for that, Kai rumbled softly, my people will be forever grateful. The sun set over Haven's Rest, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the valley below, dragons moved freely for the first time in centuries. In the medical center, volunteers from a dozen species worked together. In the nesting grounds, new life waited to begin. One human's stubborn compassion had rewritten the fate of an entire species. And as night fell on the sanctuary, Jake Morrison knew this was just the beginning.